Welcome to Professor Game Podcast, where we interview successful practitioners of games, gamification, and game thinking who brings the best of their experiences to get ideas, insights, and inspiration that help us in the process of getting the students to learn what we teach. And I'm Rob Alvarez. I teach and work at IE Business School in Madrid, where we create interactive and engaging learning materials. Want to know more? Go to professorgame.com/subscribe, start on our email list, and ask me anything. Engagers, welcome to another episode of the Professor Game Podcast. And this time we are with an associate professor, Bill Watson. But before we get started, before we do that intro, we want to know, Bill, are you prepared to engage?
I am prepared.
Let's do this because Bill Watson, as I mentioned, is an associate professor of learning, design, and technology in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction at the Purdue University, and he's also the director of the Purdue Center for Serious Games and Learning in Virtual Environment. His research is definitely focused on the critical systemic change on education to realize a personalized paradigm, including the application of technologies such as video games and digital badges and the envisioning of new learning management systems to support this paradigm. Is there anything that we're missing, anything else that you're working on, anything else you want to let us know before we get into the interview?
Well, we may get into it a little bit in the interview, we might not, but recently I've also kind of expanded things to attitudinal learning. So how can we design instruction to shift people's attitudes and ultimately change their behaviors? So that's another kind of new aspect that wasn't where I started, but my research has kind of led me to that, and I find that pretty exciting as well.
Yeah, it sounds definitely exciting. And what does a regular, day or schedule for you look like? Again, typically, we know we are in these strange times, but whatever you want to go for, if it's nowadays or, a few weeks ago, what does that look like? What are you doing on a daily basis?
Sure, absolutely. Well, in these strange days, these days I'm getting up and helping my son with e-learning, which is tons of fun. But beyond that, actually, my day-to-day job hasn't changed immensely. We're not on campus, but my program has an entirely online master's program in addition to our face-to-face program. So typically I'm teaching, whatever courses I'm teaching, whether online or face-to-face. So this semester, the course I'm teaching is a course on the design of educational video games. And that one was online before all of this broke out. So it's kind of been the same with that of working with students around the world and teaching them. And then, of course, I've got my research that I'm working on and my other duties to the university as well. So that's kind of the day-to-day of where I'm at. And part of that work is, the grant projects I'm on, and not all of those are game-related, but some of them are. So that's kind of where games are crossing with me in my day-to-day life.
That sounds very, very exciting. And talking about excitement, we always like to start off as well our interviews with this sort of backwards question in a way. We would like for you to tell us a story of a time, of course, that you set up to do something great with games, with all this research that you're doing, or a project, something related to this whole area of games and learning. And of course, you set out to do something, but you ran into this first attempt in learning, or fail, as we also know it. And of course, this led you to some sort of learning experience as well, or we want to know how you sort of got out of that. We want to be there with you and learn from that experience that you had.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I grew up a gamer. Some of my earliest memories are playing video games with my older brothers. There's an old arcade game called Phoenix that is one of my earliest memories, was playing that in the pizza restaurant of our local small town that we lived in. And my oldest brother would have me stand on a chair, and I would hit the fire and the shield buttons while he moved the spaceship around. So I grew up a gamer playing, tabletop games and video games and all that. So it was always kind of in the back of my mind. And my first job in higher ed out of my master's work was as a lecturer of computer technology at IUPUI in Indianapolis. And that particular campus is interesting because it's about half the students are kind of your traditional students, and about half of them are adults who are coming back from the workforce to get a degree. So in seeing those students, it was a really interesting mix because those who were fresh out of high school were often just highly disengaged, and you really had to work to try to lead them to any sort of learning that might be occurring. You really had to kind of spoon feed them everything, while the adults who had been out of school, for quite a bit of time, often, over a decade, were really trying to wring all the learning they could. They saw the direct relevance to what they were learning to their careers. They would question, ask why, alter alternatives. So they were very intellectually engaged. And And that, as an instructor, really led me to go back and get my doctoral degree to say, well, first of all, what sort of instruction can I get to engage those students who aren't engaged? And I went in with that mindset that video games could potentially be that answer. I had grown up playing Oregon Trail, as a lot of people my age had in school. And while I enjoyed the game, I didn't necessarily learn that much from it because we were just told to, go play this game and you're going to learn from it. But in my mind, I was like, well, I love video games. If we could use video games for learning, maybe that's a way to reach these students. So I went back for my doctoral degree. For my dissertation work, it was designing this educational video game for one of my classes that I taught. And what I found there was a couple of kind of hard lessons learned. One was that as I was a full-time student and a full-time instructor, I had limited time for developing the game, so I worked with a student to develop it and had one who kind of went AWOL on me. So I lost quite a bit of time in development, had to get a replacement student and kind of start from scratch there. But in turning my design and realizing my design, making it a reality, another thing that I learned was that not everyone are gamers and they don't all have that kind of gamer mindset, because one of the forms of engagement I decided to target was challenge in the game and kind of, I guess you would call it gamer humor. So I had when people would fail in the game, I would have a big finger come up on the screen pointing at them saying, like, you're horrible, you failed, or something like that, which I thought was funny. And when I ran the game to collect data, the gamers in the class loved it. And they're like, oh, that's great. I'm horrible. I sucked. I'm going to get in there and try it again. So they loved it. They thought it was funny. It made them want to get in there and try again. What I found was those who were not gamers in the class were actually kind of offended by that. They're like, who are you to tell me I'm bad? You're supposed to be more supportive than this and that sort of thing. So it was just a very kind of different mindset for me of like, oh, well, not everyone are gamers, and I can't just, put on my gamer glasses and say everyone's going to treat this the same way. So that was one aspect, but the big fail I kind of learned with that, again, my first educational game that I designed, was how important it was to have very clear, consistent feedback throughout the game. Because what I had was the students playing the game, and my thought was, well, they're going to play it at least once, maybe a couple times, and they're going to kind of figure out where they went wrong at the end of the game. By withholding feedback, I did have some, but not as clear as it needed to be. They really struggled to get the learning outcomes I was looking for and the lessons from that. So, I did go back and fix that game up some. I quickly transitioned, to my position at Purdue, so that kind of course went away because that's no longer the area I teach. But that was a real central lesson for me, was one, that, not all my target learners are going to be gamers. And two, really the importance of very clear and consistent feedback in the games, which is something, I had learned in my degree on instructional design. I had learned that. But I hadn't brought that over to the gaming realm. And so that was something that I really took away from that moving forward was, we learn by making mistakes in games, but if the feedback's not clear about what that mistake was and how we can take a different approach, it's hard to be engaged in the game itself, and it's hard to learn from it.
Absolutely. And I would say because you were mentioning that this was something that you sort of knew already to a certain capacity. I'm guessing as well that to some capacity, you also knew that, like, if you're going to design for someone, if you're creating a learning experience for someone, you have to get to know that person. And if you get to know them, you would probably have found out at that point that they were not all gamers, that they had some sort of different sort of spectrum for humor. So I think those two lessons, and I think they're key not only because of the importance that they have, but also to highlight that sometimes those things that we kind of know, that we've been told these things, and maybe we've even experienced them ourselves, it's not easy to always keep them sort of front of mind. I mean, sometimes it's easy that we forget them at some point, that we sort of pass by and don't realize that we forgot sort of our own, not principles in the sense of, our ethics and so on, but that we do forget something that we thought was key and we've always gone for it and talked about it. Applying it over and over again is what actually gets us to do that. So I think that's a wonderful story. Thank you very much for telling it today in the podcast. Is there anything else you'd like to add? Because I think it was fantastic feedback. I don't want to sort of break your great learning from that.
No, I think you've summed it up very well. And even to a degree what I was teaching, because actually that course that I was implementing this in was a systems analysis and design course where I was stressing to the students the importance of doing your upfront analysis and getting frequent feedback And then not carrying that over myself to the game design certainly came back to hit me.
There you go. So I'm sure, again, this is not about being, smarter or knowing everything. Sometimes it's about the application. We do things, we test it out, we see what happens, and we get that feedback from what our designs are. And that's a fundamental step. That iteration that you made is great. And taking a spin on this and actually going for, one of those challenges that you faced, sort of head on and actually had some success on. I mean, like trying to design, this was your first educational game. I'm sure you've made other projects in the future. Is there a story that you sort of a highlight for you that you'd like to bring up? And again, we want to be there to those maybe things you'd attribute part of that success to.
I guess when I'm thinking about what I bring and the processes I bring, one thing that I try to always make sure that I do is, one, remember that games can be fun and games can be creative, and trying to make sure that I have that up front of, any project I come to, what it can be, and that you don't necessarily have to box yourself in. So I think that the creative aspect is something that I often find with my students and my students that I teach about game design, is that a lot of times it's almost they enter into games almost with a sense of, sheepishness or shame, and that, we're learning, this is supposed to be serious stuff. And I remember actually I had someone at a conference come up to me and say, yeah, but, should learning really be fun? And, my answer at that point was like, well, yes, it should be. When you see students come into schools when they're young, they're highly motivated and excited about learning, but they quickly can have that drummed out of them in the current system. So something that I always try to bring to people is to be creative, to be fun, to look at the engagement aspect and focus on that. And don't box yourself in before you have to. So that kind of translates to, as you said, first of all, understanding the context and the situation and kind of why do we need a game here? What's going to be the benefit of a game? But then looking at what games do well and how can they be that hook and how can they engage people and how can we be creative and do things with games that we couldn't do otherwise.
Absolutely. It's a key lesson as well. Like realizing that potential that we sometimes maybe forget. Like if you want to make a game and the game is not supposed to be fun, then why is it a game and not the typical, why don't you just put a reading there? I mean, you do have to make sure that the learning is there. You definitely want to make sure that the learning is there and it's sound and, you're not teaching people something that is, not true or not precise. But if you're doing it through a strategy like using games for this learning to keep the engagement high, well, how do you keep the engagement high? You want people to have at least some level of fun, to be engaged with this. And that's something that you actually have to design for. That's something that you have to keep sort of front of mind, as you were mentioning.
Absolutely.
So when you're creating these games for education, I'm guessing that you have some sort of strategy, some processes, some steps that you do. Can you run us through that? I mean, let's say you're starting to design a game today or tomorrow. How do you get started? What are the next steps? Like, what would an outlook be for you in that sense?
So a lot of times what I start with is, like I said, first of all, what is the context? What's the problem? What are we trying to solve with the game? And is a game necessarily the answer there? Because I have had people come to me with proposals before where they're gravitating to the idea of games because that's interesting to them, but it's not necessarily the answer for every situation. So first of all, as we mentioned, that importance of analysis of who are the target learners, what's the context, how is it going to be implemented? But beyond that, I'm also trying to take a look at, as part of that understanding, how can we extend learning beyond just the game? So to me, it's really important that the game is the hook, the game is the engagement, the game presents the problem and helps learners try to figure out how to solve it. But that doesn't mean we have to limit the learning to the game. And I had mentioned, my own experience with games in school was Oregon Trail, which is, an American history game. And we were told to go play this game and we were going to learn. And what I did as a gamer was play the game and gravitate towards the gameplay aspects that were interesting to me. So that translated into hunting in this particular game because I had guns and I could shoot things. Well, there's a lot more going on in Oregon Trail than just the hunting aspect, but that was what I gravitated to. And so while there were learning opportunities, I really didn't take them out of the game. So, something that's really been a core aspect of how I plan to use games and try to use games is that the games are going to hook us in there and they're going to engage us, but the learning doesn't have to be limited to them. And in fact, if we can expand it beyond to non-game activities, that's fantastic. One of the studies I had was taking a look at a high school history teacher who had been using video games to teach for a number of years. And he mentioned kind of the same sort of lessons that he had learned. He had started off and said, you're going to play this game and learn from it. And then quickly the gamers were dominating the game, just focusing on the gameplay and not any sort of learning aspect. This was a World War II history game, so he was trying to use it to teach how the end of World War I led to the start of World War II, and had the students playing different countries. And what happened on the first turn is the student who was playing Germany turned around and attacked Japan, which was completely at odds with the goal of the game, gameplay, let alone learning. And he did it because his friend was over there. So they were, approaching the game from a gameplay mindset. And he quickly realized he needed to set up a sort of facilitation approach to manage their learning and help them shift from a pure play mindset to, okay, it's okay to play and have fun here, but we also need to be mindful of our learning. And that means that we need to be reflective. We need to think about, what choices are available to us, what choices we made. We need to think about what we might do differently, what our expected outcomes are, and why. So in watching him facilitate this game, we went in and watched him before he used games, where he was just kind of teaching his normal class. We watched him as he was teaching the game, and then we watched after they were done playing games. And what we saw was a very black and white situation of going from a traditional teacher-centric learning environment where he was the one doing all the talking, providing all the energy. He was trying very, very hard to engage these students, telling jokes, asking them questions. And still by the end of the class, the vast majority were just completely zoned out and completely disengaged from the learning that was going on. Then when we watched the game, it transformed into this very loud, energetic environment where the students were running around in groups, asking questions, planning what they were doing. They were talking about the game and talking about their class and history over lunch and in the hallway. So it just completely transformed from a teacher-centric environment to a learner-centered environment where the students were in control. They were pushing their learning. They were actually reading their textbook, which was not required reading at this point, to try to get clues for how to win the game. So it was just a very, very different sort of environment. And in watching him do that and watching him facilitate this, it was very clear to me that he was implementing very similar strategies to how we facilitate problem-based learning, which is, another popular learner-centered approach in my field that we recommend. So I really think the facilitation of learning around games can be very important. It's also important to know why you're using them and what learning outcomes you want to get from them, and then structuring an environment that's going to really ensure as best as possible that learning will kind of come from that. So that's always kind of where I start, particularly with when you're doing game development. Oftentimes you have limitations for exactly the scope of what you're able to achieve. So I always start with understanding what we're trying to achieve and why, how games are a fit for it, and what we can do both in-game and out of game to create an environment that's going to be pushing that learning as far as possible.
That makes a lot of sense. And I just have a quick follow-up question to that, because one thing that we've observed is that after playing a game, a simulation, one of these environments where students are very engaged, and of course it's very well tied to the learning objectives, sometimes sort of to cement or to set that learning in a stronger fashion. One of the things that we've seen and we've used in even further success is that stage of the debriefing. Is that something that you've seen also is, that helps or aids the learning and makes it improve or cement over time?
Yeah, absolutely. And that was a kind of follow-up article we published after that first case study, was taking a look at this and saying, how can we facilitate learning around there? How can we take some of the strategies for problem-based learning facilitation and apply them to this sort of approach where the game is serving as the problem and the facilitator is helping structure learning around that? And certainly reflecting back on that and questioning is a really big piece of that. So that's definitely a core aspect of too often gamers in particular who are used to playing video games. They make decisions, they think very quickly, and they move forward very quickly without necessarily going back and debriefing on what happened and why and how things might be different. So that's a core aspect of facilitation, is to help people. And this was something we observed in this teacher when he was teaching the class, was that the students would be very loud, talking to each other, running back and forth to set up strategy with the different groups. So it was a very loud environment. He would be walking around the classroom answering questions, but every once in a while, he would be able to pause the game and say, okay, everyone stop, hands off the mouse, hands off the keyboard, turn and look at me. Let's talk about what just happened. Let's talk about why that happened. Is that what you expected? Would you do things different another time? So that debriefing was something that was happening. Sometimes he was stopping gameplay to do it. Other times they were talking about it after gameplay concluded for that day. So that was definitely a key aspect of what we observed and something that I think is really important.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I have sort of the same observations. I was very curious about what you had seen, and that's definitely a key aspect. Like, you're giving people both the permission to sort of absorb that learning, and sometimes even like pointing it out. Sometimes you even learned already something, but you don't realize that that's something that's new within your system, and that's a new tool that you can utilize under other circumstances, and that is a fantastic opportunity to do that. So always like setting time, as you were mentioning, during or at some point after, like understand what happened here, I think is definitely one of the keys to this whole strategy.
For sure.
Just a quick break before we continue. Are you enjoying this podcast? If you're listening through a podcasting app, please subscribe and rate us on the app. This will be of great help to reach more engagers so we can change the world together through gamification. And Bill, what would you say is, we've been talking about one of these things, maybe about the whole debriefing, but maybe it could be the debriefing, maybe it could be definitely something else as well. Would you say that there is some sort of best practice or some strategy or some, step that you would say, well, if you do this when you're creating these educational games, that will definitely help you have a better game, or, do it faster, or whatever metric you want to improve?
Sure. I mean, I think always for me, it's a matter of testing, and getting that feedback. So I'm a big proponent of kind of quick and dirty assessment of how the game and its design is going. So that means as soon as you have something you can get some feedback on, to do so. That's something I push for my students a lot in the educational game design class, is you don't want to go so far down the road that once you get the feedback, you're unable to respond to it. So I think it's really important, just in all aspects of the game, to be getting feedback on your ideas. As soon as you can get something on paper, you don't have to wait for it to be produced digitally to get feedback on it. So I think constant feedback in that iterative cycle of design, evaluation, implementation, and redesign is really important. That, I think that process, it's really problematic to be designing in isolation. And just like we talked about the struggles I had earlier, where basically I was doing that and things were not working out, and what I thought was a sound design ended up not being a sound design. If I'd been getting feedback on that earlier, I could have been correcting those issues prior to it being such a problem to make changes in the actual development of the game. So that's always the kind of core thing that I come back to is, get your designs in front of people and get feedback on them when it's still easy to design, and make sure you're getting that feedback frequently and throughout the design and development process.
Absolutely. Absolutely crucial as well to be able to act upon that feedback soon enough. And if you don't, as you said, you don't do it at the end of the whole process, it's going to be harder to act upon both, of the actual work, and even emotionally, you're more tied to how that looks like at this point than you were when you were getting started, for sure. After this conversation that we've been having, is there somebody that comes to your mind that you'd say, oh, I'd like to listen to this person on an interview like this in Professor Game?
So, as a gamer, the funny thing is that I probably play less, video games right now in my life than I ever have before, which is a sad thing. It's not by design, but it's a consequence of how busy I am. But, as a gamer, I definitely have particular preferences that I lean towards for the type of games I like. And for me, that's always been strong narrative games that have a really strong story that drives them, strong character. And personally, as a game designer, someone who looks for, games as a potential learning tool in education, I think strong narrative games and games with a really clear, strong context tend to lend themselves well to the sort of gameplay that we can use to support learning. Not to say that it can't be done, but games that rely on twitch reflexes and, fast responses don't really give you time to think and don't give you time to, debrief or reflect on what you're doing and what the problems are. So I think, games that present strong stories and present problems in a narrative way are a good model for gameplay approaches we can use with educational games. So personally, I would have an interest in some of my favorite game developers or directors for some of the entertainment games I've encountered where I thought, wow, they've done stories so well there. So, probably my favorite game ever, although it's hard to name one, but if I had to pick one, would probably be The Last of Us. And their development of character in that and plotting out that story was so strong. I'd love to hear how they went about creating that narrative. Naughty Dog, Last of Us, they did Uncharted 4, where they did a great job. I think his name's Bruce Straley was the director for those, if I remember correctly. So I'd love to see how they set out making that sort of narrative. Naughty Dog's a favorite of mine. Another production group is Quantic Dream. They did Heavy Rain, which was a really, really dark noir game that I loved, but I've been unable to replay since I had kids of my own because the subject matter is so dark. But both those studios did just such a profound job of moving narrative and games forward. I'd love to hear the development crews from them talk about how they went about making that happen, since I think that has a direct relevance to gameplay approaches in educational games.
Absolutely. The whole drive behind the story is something that gets humans in general, I'd argue, engaged, and that's where the power of story-based discourse and story-based, and for example, in business education, a typical thing to use is cases, and why are cases being so, or why have they been so relevant amongst many things? Because they're a story, and the students can easily relate to these stories. Like the best cases are things that you would say it's easy for a student to relate to and to, go deep into that story and feel he's part of that situation and, sort of go into the solutions. That's another fantastic case or situation in which the story is fundamental. And I have to say The Last of Us is one of my favorite games as well. It's definitely top of the list.
Sure.
So you mentioned a couple of game directors. That would be fantastic. And would you recommend any book for us to read, for the engagers to read, to either inspire us, help us directly create these educational games?
So I no longer use this as a textbook, but I did use it for a number of years. And it was what I went to when I was first going to design my educational game. Okay, how am I going to do this? How am I going to be approaching this? And it's by Salen and Zimmerman. They published a book called Rules of Play, and I want to say it's around 2011 or so it's a little bit older. But what I really like about that is the focus is just on game design, so it's not educational game design. But what I like is they really strip out kind of by chapter different approaches to, I don't want to say it's not practical, but it's almost more theoretical in some ways, in that they'll take a systems look at games and how games can be systems, and they'll take another look at a different look at how games can be structured. What I really took from them is, again, this concept of rules of play. As they say at the core, what we're looking for in games, and I would say, even more so in educational games, is meaningful play. As a player, you want to have a meaningful experience, and you want to feel like you're impacting the game and the outcomes of that game. And they really break that down to the components of meaningful play is that you present an interesting choice or problem to the player. They are able to perceive the different solutions that they might take or choices that they're going to make in that. And then we're able to have meaningful outcomes communicated to them of this is the outcome of your choice and why it's meaningful to the ongoing game and its play. And that's kind of a simple concept, but a couple of things with that book is, one, they present that concept of meaningful play and how we can try to achieve it, as well as a real breakdown of different ways of looking at engagement and aspects of game that I really like. But they also have kind of case interviews with game designers in between almost every chapter, where they talk about, very similar to kind of what you're doing here, of, as a game designer, you were presented with this problem. How did you go about solving it? So you get very interesting things, just like, I grew up reading The Lord of the Rings, so they had an interview with the designer of the Lord of the Rings board game, and he just talks about how you're trying to translate a plot, which is multiple people trying to take this ring from one place to another, and how can we translate that into a meaningful game experience where it's collaborative play, but it's engaging. And I just found those cases very interesting, where they were breaking down these kind of design problems and how those game designers responded to it, as well as just kind of breaking down in a digestible way what is it that games are doing and how can we try to get there and how can we make them engaging and meaningful. So that's still a book that I like to go back to. And then just for giggles, Ready Player One is one of my favorite novels of all time. as a gamer of turning the world into a game in itself and turning the Easter eggs and the hunts and all that sort of stuff into a quest. So just for fun, that's the fiction book that I like to go back to as a gamer.
I recently saw the movie as well, which is definitely, movies always lose some of the magic from books, but it's always it was for me at least a fun reminder of the whole situation.
Yeah, for sure.
What would you say is your favorite game in this case? I know you mentioned some of these, but if you had to narrow it down maybe to one game, again, it could be your favorite game of all time, your current favorite game. I know you're not playing, which is exactly a situation that I'm at. You're not playing as much as you'd want to or did in the past. But, once you hear that question, what comes to your mind first?
I would probably say for video games, like I mentioned, The Last of Us is one that really sticks with me. I just thought the development of those characters and and I've seen, there have been great stories. Like Heavy Rain was a really great story. I really loved it. I actually really liked how Telltale Games did Walking Dead. I'm a Walking Dead fan. And I thought they were one of the first games out there that really could have an emotional impact on you. But I just thought in terms of character development in a game, and I remember reading, articles about debates between people about, well, can games really be literature or not? And I just thought that The Last of Us did such a tremendous job of creating those characters and charting their journey from point A to B. I just really thought that was masterful. In terms of, while I'm not playing as many video games as I once did, it's kind of the golden age of board games with Kickstarter out there and all the different games that are being developed. So certainly there's a lot of games I'm putting up on my table. Even if I'm not getting into video games as much anymore. But those are kind of the ones that I really look to. Absolutely.
Those are great games as well. And related to all these conversations that we've been having, what would you say is your superpower, that sweet spot, that thing that you feel you do great when creating these educational games?
So my background, long before... when I first started college, my undergraduate major was English literature and creative writing. So at that point, I was planning on being a novelist, maybe a poet, something like that. And I was really immersed in all those things. And, I was interning with my university's literary magazine. And I was seeing, when I was going to apply to graduate schools to further this, I was seeing my friends who are graduate students in creative writing graduating and getting jobs as, clerks at bookstores and things like that. And I thought, gee, I don't know if I want to take on more debt to go that route. And just kind of, the internet was just kind of blowing up there. So I ended up going into planning to be a webmaster and that sort of thing. But I still feel like I fall back on that creative idea of, how can we make this engaging? How can we make it bigger? Can we take a problem and take, a realistic problem, but present it in a really interesting fashion? And this is still something that I try to talk to my students about is, can you make it bigger? We don't have to be simulations. Not everything has to be SimCity. So, the examples I give them is, it's been years now, but there was a economics course that was taught entirely as a game from a college, maybe in Virginia or something. I can't remember. I mean, it's been probably over 10 years since I'd read about it in the news. But he designed the economics course as a game. And it would have been very easy for someone to say, okay, I'm going to create, your basic economics game and you're going to learn the market and do this or trade stocks or whatever. But what he did was have the game be your spaceship, you're fleeing, people who are attacking your spaceship crashes on an alien planet and you have to get parts to repair it. So you have to learn the local economy and learn to barter and sell to get the things you need to escape the planet, So basically we can learn the economic principles in a much more engaging sort of context and problem. So I try to bring that and say, how can we make it bigger? How can we make it engaging? How can we up the stakes from ordinary to something exciting while still keeping the learning objectives, accurate and realistic? So, I was consulting on a recent grant proposal where they were trying to teach stuff that was way over my head. These are people who work with nanotechnology and gene editing and this sort of stuff and trying to come up with new pharmaceuticals, at a molecular level, all stuff that was way over my head. But when they were coming to me, they were pitching this problem of we're trying to use this as outreach to teach about these sort of approaches to high schoolers. And, the game idea was kind of, you're very straightforward. You're a scientist and you're trying to, create these sort of things. So it was very much leaning towards just kind of the typical simulation where I'm going to simulate this sort of thing. And So it was asking them, well, why do you want this as a game? Why are you reaching out to the high schoolers? And it's, well, we need more people in this field. We need people excited about this. We need them to recognize the impact that scientists and people doing this work can have throughout the world and around our lives. And so I said, so what you're talking about is basically scientists can be heroes, right? So let's make them heroes. Let's give them a profound problem, whether it's a pandemic that's turning into a zombie apocalypse or whatever we're going to do, but let's present a profound problem where the scientists can be these superheroes by doing this sort of thing and up the problem from something that's kind of staid and two-dimensional and boring to a really big problem that's going to get them engaged and excited about this sort of thing.
Absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. And once again, I always like to make sure that you guests who are sharing all of this knowledge, all of this understanding are, well, at least thanked for, because I think this investment of your time here with the engagers today is fantastic. But of course, I don't want to end this interview before you tell us where we can find out more about Bill Watson and what you're doing. If there's anywhere where we can interact with you on the internet as well, that would be great. And of course, if you have any final piece of advice, that's going to be very welcome.
I guess the only final piece of advice I might leave with is, again, remembering why you're doing games and what you're trying to use them for, whether it's games or gamification. That's an important thing to consider of how you're going to be approaching and what you can be using it for. And, if you do decide to use them, then be willing to take advantage of them and go whole hard into what they can do and what their benefits can be. Don't be shy about embracing them. If you're going to go with games, go for that engagement. Don't tiptoe into it. If you're going to go into gamification, don't slap on a high score board and say, that's it. That's where we're going to stop. Think about how you can engage both in the game and out and really take them to heart. And then I guess what I would leave with for interacting is, if you Google Purdue and William, I think I'm on there as William Watson. So Purdue and William Watson, you can find my website, but probably best way to get a hold of me is still email. And that's B as in boy, R as in Robert, Watson, BR Watson at purdue.edu is a great way to get a hold of me. And I, do try to get back to my email and connect with people who are willing to connect with me. So thanks for reaching out to me.
That's great. It's actually the way in which we got connected as well. So that's definitely recommended. So again, thank you very much, Bill, for this time today with us. However, at least for now and for today, it is time to say that it's game over. Engagers, it is fantastic to have you around, and thank you for listening to the Professor Game podcast. If you want more interviews with incredible guests like Bill Watson, then please go to professorgame.com/subscribe and get started into our email list. That way, we will be in contact and you'll be the first to know of any opportunities, any new things, any features, any news that you might have that Professor Game actually might have for you. And if you want to know who is coming up next week, then all you have to do is subscribe using your favorite podcast app and listen to the next episode of Professor Game. See you there.